I'm Sandra Wilson, and I'm going to talk about coding for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. But first, two things. One, I want to know who you guys are. So how many are kind of law enforcement, crime and justice people? Okay. What about international development kind of people? Okay, what about social welfare, education? Okay, good. What about something else? What's the something else? Evidence. So it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. Just, well, that's good to know too. All right, so the other thing I was going to show you is the Campbell Collaboration website, because in the Resource Center here, under this training thing, is where you are likely to find our videos and slide presentations after this. Bjorn Tommy's nodding his head. And then also under this research section and the methods policy briefs is where you're likely to find Kariana's information retrieval brief that she showed you in the last session, as well as other goodies. So just a little public service announcement for Campbell Collaboration. Okay, so I'm at Vanderbilt University, and I do some meta-analysis and systematic reviews as part of my job there. I also work on field trials of educational and social interventions. I'm also one of the Campbell Collaboration editors, specifically of the Education Coordinating Group. So just to give you a little idea of who I am. And so the work, this is a little outline slide. And I haven't figured out how long it takes me to go through all this, so we'll see. But I think you guys should feel free to ask questions that are specific to the kinds of projects that you're working on, because I can give you examples, or we can talk about different ways of coding different things that make sense for you. But in general, there are different levels of coding in a systematic review, and I'll talk about some of the basics for each of these kind of levels. First, the screening studies for eligibility, so whether you want to include or exclude them in your systematic review. And there are two levels of that. One at the abstract level, so from the results of your search. I'm probably standing right in front of the slides, aren't I? So one at the abstract level, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then at the full text level, where you're really reading the full article and deciding whether it's in or out. And then the content coding of your studies. So that has to do with coding both the methodological quality, but also details about the interventions and the subjects in the studies. And effect size coding, which I think is the other Wilson right after me. And then some common mistakes that we all make when we're doing coding. So why do we code studies? What's the point of this? First, coding, as you'll see, we'll go through all the kinds of things that you're going to be coding. Some people call this data extraction, by the way. I call it coding, but just those are synonyms for us. So the first reason that you do this is to really provide an accounting of the research included in your review. What's in there, what does it look like, what are its characteristics. It also helps you identify what's missing from the literature. Not only what kinds of studies are missing from the literature, but what kinds of information are missing from within the studies that isn't commonly reported. So you identify the characteristics of the interventions, the subjects, the methods. That's the point, is really getting deep into what these studies are all about. And assuming that different primary studies produce different results, which they often do, because they're different, study coding allows you to identify variables that might possibly explain those differences. Okay, so when you start the coding process, you're starting from the end of your literature search, or well, the end of your first literature search, really. So you have a set of abstracts and titles that are the results of your search that are in some sort of database. And you want to know if those are going to be relevant to your systematic review. And sometimes when you're doing a really complex search of a topic that has broad terms, I use high school dropout as an example. When you search on the term dropout, you're going to get studies of high school dropouts and maybe why they dropped out, and studies of dropout interventions to keep kids in school, but you're also going to get studies of people who've dropped out of therapy or dropped out of a counseling session. So there's a lot of irrelevant things there. So you're screening the abstracts to see if they're about the thing that you think they're supposed to be about. And you exclude, obviously, irrelevant studies, but don't assume that the title and the abstract are going to tell you everything about your study that you need to know. They're not going to give you reliable information about how the subjects were assigned to the interventions. It's just, they might say RCT, the medical studies are going to be more reliable with that, but social sciences don't. So the abstract screening level is really throwing out the studies that are about monkeys when you're interested in high school dropout. That's an extreme example, but you'll get the point. We have contests around the office over who gets the funniest abstract when you're screening 10,000 of these things. And the monkey studies are always entertaining. And we do, when you're doing a lot of abstracts, you may not have the resources to double screen at this level. We do training, we'll do samples and have people screen samples together until we get 100% really. And then we let people go off and do single coding. And when in doubt, you keep the study and read the full article. Okay, so then once you have this set of full text articles that you think are going to be relevant to your study, then you do the real inclusion, exclusion screening. This is the real thing. And you want to, and this goes back to a lot of what Jeff was talking about today, about what the population is, what the intervention is, what the comparison is, the outcomes, and the study designs. You're going to develop an eligibility screening form that has these things in it and check them off yes or no. Oftentimes, the criteria, you want to, modifying the criteria, you start out with this idea of what the studies are going to look like, but then you get something strange like, what do you do when studying dropout and there are a bunch of interventions for kids with learning disabilities that you didn't expect and it wasn't part of your original criteria? Or you're doing some development work and there's a little variation on the intervention that suddenly comes into your literature that you hadn't planned for originally. So that's when modifications come in, where you might change your criteria or make them more concrete or more explicit about what do you do when you have a study like this, because there's always going to be something different than what you expected. We double code our eligibility to make sure that we have 2 people who look at every study. There are different ways to do it. If you have a small number of studies, you really can have 2 people look at every study. In our case, what we do is when I screen something and decide it's not eligible, someone else looks at it immediately. When I decide it is eligible, it goes into the pile for coding. And at that stage, when the coder picks it up, that's the second screen to make sure that it's really in. So that makes it a little more efficient when you have a lot. And we maintain, and you should maintain, a database of the results for every single study you screen and why it was not eligible. This will help you when you're accounting the literature at the end and explaining why some studies were not eligible. But it also will help you when someone reads your article and says, why isn't my study in your review? And you need to be able to tell them why. And that happens all the time. So this is kind of small. This is an example of one of the eligibility screening forms that we use. This is a FileMaker database. Other people use different software. RevMan can do this. You can design your own. There are lots of, some people use paper or Excel spreadsheets. But in this case, I have all of my criteria. And in fact, the coders can click on the text, and it'll take them to a full text description of how they evaluate that criteria if they've forgotten. And then we have other little details about what we record. But this kind of thing, so at the end I can export this data and have a little table that explains why each study that I screened was excluded or included. Does that make sense? Okay. So once you go through this process, you're going to have a set of reports that you believe are eligible for your review. And like I said, it helps account the literature and kind of tell your readers what's available and what's not available in the literature. And most systematic reviews, Cochrane and Campbell for sure, but other groups that do systematic reviews often include a table of ineligible studies. And I think I have some examples of that. I do. So this is, we did this for the Dropout project because we had so many studies excluded. It would have been hundreds of pages to do it citation by citation. So we just gave a count of the number that did not meet the intervention criterion, a count that did not meet that criterion. But there's another way to do it. It looks like this. So each study that you, or each article that you exclude, I made these up, just has the citation and then the reason that it didn't meet your criteria. Okay. So now you're at the real coding stage, the real data extraction. How much you code from these studies depends on lots of different things. Your interests, your resources, how many studies you're likely to have in your review. It really sort of depends on what you want to do. Mostly resources are involved in making these kinds of decisions. But what you're doing here is creating a coding manual or a code book that specifies exactly what you want to extract from every study in very specific, boring detail. I'll talk a little bit about some options for how to do this operationally when I get to the end. I typically make a paper version. It's not really paper, it's Microsoft Word, but I typically type it out and then turn it into a database or turn it into a spreadsheet later. Other people have different methods. I find that having this Word document helps me kind of get my ideas straight, and then I turn it into the database. Oh, so what's in a coding manual? All right, there are different sections. These are kind of the big topic areas that you'll want to think about when coding, and then underneath these there are lots of different things you can extract from studies, and it really depends on your area. But study setting, context, authors, publication date, publication type, kind of this generic stuff. That's always interesting. It's easy to code. The methodology of the study and the quality of those methods. That's critical. Anytime you're doing a Cochrane or a Campbell review, you're going to have to do that. And it's important to know what methods were used in the study so you can decide and your readers can decide what credible evidence there is on your question. You also want to describe the interventions, and we'll talk more about how to do that, and the participants or the clients or the children or the adults or the sample, whatever, the people. The outcomes of those intervention studies. What did they affect? And you want to code details about those. And then the findings of those studies or the effect sizes. Yes. Yes.
On the grounds that study design, there's overlaps between different kinds of study design. People use the same descriptions to describe things or something else, and so on. Where does one find good guidance in that? How do you unpick that?
I will talk about that. And I don't. The answer is I don't know, really. There are lots of different ways. Eamon was asking about methods and method quality, and he said it seems like that's the most complicated and also the most critical part, which is correct. And how do you do it, given that there are so many different ways to do it? Is that a good summary? And I will talk about that more in detail, but there are different ways of coding method quality and method characteristics. And there are differences of opinion across people in the Campbell collaboration and the Cochrane collaboration and probably in this room about the best way to do it. And I'm not really sure what the best way to do it is. I'm going to give you 3 different options that I know about. There are others. And it's a matter of talking to your editor about what they're going to require, for one, or your funder about what they want you to do in terms of method quality. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go down each of these with a little more detail. And how I'm talking till 1:45. I guess I should have figured that out. 2:15? Okay, good. All right. Sorry. So, study context coding. This is fairly straightforward for the most part. It depends on what you're interested in. One thing that's important and not so easy to figure out sometimes is this issue of multiple publications or multiple articles about the same research study. Or, less common but also out there, multiple studies reported in the same publication or the same article. And it's important to be mindful of that and look for that as you're reading through these studies. Because in the social sciences, for sure, people will publish, especially if it's a large-scale RCT, they're going to publish multiple articles about this study, and you can't treat them as separate studies. It's the same sample, the same experiment. So we will go through all of our literature and find all the friends of studies so that they're coded together as a block. And then we extract the information from whichever reports have it. So we don't pick one that's primary. We might get details about the implementation fidelity from one report, details about the outcome measures from another, and the effect sizes from another. I know other people, I think it's more common in medicine to choose one when you have multiple choices. I think that's a bad idea. If you have multiple choices, you should read them all and see what you can do with them. But medical studies are formatted a little differently, so it may make sense in that context to really pick the one that has the outcomes in it that you need. Geographical information, publication type is important. We talked a little bit about grade literature and publication bias earlier, and so recording what type of publication your data come from is important. It allows you to explore those issues analytically later. Publication date and study date, those are important. They're difficult, not the publication date, but the study date is difficult to determine sometimes. So sometimes you can use publication date as a proxy. Whether it's a research project or a demonstration project or kind of a routine practice, we find is interesting in social interventions and educational interventions. May not make as much sense in international development. I mean, they're all on-the-ground real studies instead of more contrived experimental things. This is an example of a coding item from one of our coding manuals. And everything we code looks like this. So we write out exactly what we want people to look at. And when there are choices, what are they supposed to choose? And we do this for every study. And oftentimes, well, in the electronic version, the database version, people can, we have a little easy button on the screen, and people can click on it and go to a full description of how you decide. I mean, in this case, it's not difficult. But in some of the more complicated subjective items, we have steps to think about. Okay, so now study method coding. So in many cases, when you're doing a kind of typical systematic review, you're going to have experimental studies. Individuals or clusters are randomly assigned to an intervention group or a comparison group. That's kind of the classic design that goes into a systematic review. Many systematic reviews include quasi-experimental designs. So there's a control group, but maybe it wasn't assigned using a random method. As research has changed and we're getting more interested in evidence in a lot of different fields who don't use randomized designs or can't for a variety of reasons, or use alternative designs. I know the development guys, you have all these crazy economic things with propensity scores, and so there are lots of different designs that you might include in a systematic review depending on your question. And the question here is, how good are they at giving you credible evidence? How much can you trust their result? Because you're then going to combine it with all these other results and make a statement about whether something works or not. And you need to know if that's, credible, or maybe you're making a guess, or, So that's where this method coding comes in. So I think probably the most common method that people use is the Cochrane risk of bias framework, which I'll show you a little bit of. I'll let you guys do your own research on these things when you start your studies. And then there are some method quality checklists, which I'm not going to show you because they've kind of fallen out of favor. But many of these things that are on method quality checklists are things that are important when thinking about methodological quality. And then finally, I'm going to show you the way that I do things, and other people. It's not just me. I code the methodological characteristics directly and evaluate how they influence the outcomes of the studies. And there's variations on all these and combinations of all of these. And it's something to talk about with your editors and your funders about what they want you to do. And also fight about if you want to do it a different way. It's perfectly within your rights to propose a new and better way to do things. So Cochrane risk of bias is focused on identifying potential sources of bias in the studies that are included in your review. And the most important of those, I think, or probably the most common and maybe the most egregious, would be selection bias. And so these are, in spite of having a randomized design, or even if you don't have a randomized design, there may be systematic differences between your groups at the baseline. And if you are not sure if your treatment and your comparison group are the same at the baseline, and then they're different after your treatment, you don't know if that difference at the end of the program is associated with the intervention, with these differences beforehand. This is standard experimental design stuff. This is important to try to determine from all your studies. In Cochrane, the big way that they do this is by coding allocation concealment and sequence generation. So that means determining if the assignment was concealed from the people who are in the intervention and comparison group, which makes sense when you're doing a study with pills and you give people pills that look all the same, so no one knows if they have the real thing or the placebo. Of course, when I'm doing a violence prevention program in middle schools, the kids who end up in the violence prevention program know they're in a violence prevention program. And the kids who get, watching National Geographic TV for an hour after school instead know they're watching National Geographic. So sometimes the allocation concealment thing doesn't really work so well. But that doesn't mean you don't have selection bias. And so there are other ways to think about that, which I'll talk about. But you can sort of think about this in your head. Another way to look at whether your groups are equivalent at the beginning is to measure that and code your pretests and code characteristics of the groups that might be associated with the outcome. So performance bias is another thing that you're looking for when you're doing this risk of bias coding. And that means that there's something other than the intervention affects the groups differently. This is mostly having to do with blinding of the participants. Again, a little complicated because it's hard to blind people. Well, it's probably not hard to blind people, but in this context, it doesn't really work. Attrition bias, this is critical in every study that you're coding, and it doesn't matter what method quality thing you use. I think everybody should code attrition. And code, if you can, code the loss in the two groups separately. So how many people were lost from the intervention groups? How many people were lost from the control groups? Detection bias is that the method of assessing the outcomes affects those outcomes or affects the group comparisons. So this comes up when we do observational, I'll start with the violence prevention. And one of the outcomes in the violence prevention studies is teacher ratings of children's behavior. And if the teachers know which students have been in the program, which they often do because they're delivering the program, that maybe is going to affect how they rate the children after the study. So what about if the parents are rating the kids? Maybe that's a little more removed from the situation. So it's something that you can try to code. Oftentimes in social research, it doesn't work so well, and you need to think about other ways to get at this same issue when you're coding your studies. We use observers to do some of our coding, or in our field trials, and it's hard to keep the observers blind. We don't tell them before they go what kind of classroom they're going to be in, but they know once you walk in the door that this is, an intervention classroom and this is a comparison classroom. But so the coding blinding may not work, but it's still important to think about detection bias and try to come up with other ways to determine whether that kind of bias is happening in the studies that you're working with. This is another big issue, and I don't think anybody has a good way to handle reporting bias. People who do big research studies might only report in their journal articles the outcomes that have something interesting to say or something flashy, and they may not even tell you that they measured all these other outcomes. If they do, code it. You know, how many outcomes did they measure? How many outcomes were you able to report effect sizes on? In Cochrane, they use kind of a low, high, unclear thing. A lot of the things that I've been saying as we're going through this is getting deeper into each of these and coming up with real ways to code attrition. Don't just tell me it's high risk. Tell me how many people were lost. That's kind of where I was going with that. Okay. So I've been inserting most of this into talking about the official risk of bias. There are modifications out there that I have seen people use, especially having to do with quasi-experimental studies or time series designs and other kinds of designs that don't fit as well into the risk of bias scheme. And that means coding other things that are going to get at the kinds of bias that you think might be operating. Okay. The grade system I know less about. I've just started exploring how we might make use of it. I find it to be a little more contextual and a little more qualitative, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I can imagine this being useful in a table where you're, maybe you have a systematic review with half a dozen studies in it. So it's a small review. You might be able to use this to give some really good contextual information about the quality of evidence from each of the trials that are in your review. But the kinds of things they have you think about in the grade system might also help you design more objective coding items that you can use in a small or a large review. So it considers the quality of evidence, much like the risk of bias thing. It's specific to the different outcomes, which I find useful. And it considers some of these other things like sparse data and consistency and inconsistency of results within a particular trial across the different outcomes. That isn't necessarily part of the risk of bias tool. And there's software for this. I don't know if you can see that little link there, but just search on grade and Cochrane and you'll find it. Okay, so method quality checklists. There are lots of these out there, hundreds of them, in fact. And people who've done research on how well these things work believe that overall study quality scores are questionable in their reliability and validity based on the checklists. That they conflate the different methodological issues, where I think, and one of the good features of grade and risk of bias and coding methodologies specifically has to do with looking at different methodological issues separately and really thinking about how they influence the results. So it's, it's really preferable to look at the potential influence of the components of methodological quality rather than some score, basically. And don't ever do this. This is a really bad idea. I won't even go into why, just don't do it. It's one of those things. Okay, So this is kind of a summary of how I think about methodological quality and how we code some things. There are lots of different ways to do this. But instead of us going through and saying this is a low quality, medium quality, high quality on this element, I go in and figure out how subjects were assigned. Did they use a random method? What was that method? Did they assign groups? Is it a cluster randomized design versus an individual randomized design? Is it some kind of quasi-random design like every other person comes in? You know, really getting into the nitty-gritty of that assignment. Attrition, crossovers, dropouts, other changes to that assignment. We go in and count if they tell us. All of these things. What does the control group look like? How did the children get into the control group? If it's a quasi-experiment, did they take children who volunteered to be in the program and then take kids who look similar from the next town over? Or did they do propensity scores? Or did they do something else? So really getting into kind of how they got into the control group or how they created a control group. Are there multiple intervention and control groups? How were they configured and assigned? This is a big one, kind of the real initial comparability of the groups at the pretest. This can tell you a lot about selection bias. So we make effect sizes for the pretests. We code effect sizes that compare the gender ratios in the groups, the age, parents' education if they give you that. So we have a whole set of effect sizes. We can actually come up with an index based on all these variables that they usually report in Table 1 that tell us how similar the groups are. Other aspects of methods. You can tell I'm the method geek, so I like talking about this stuff. I can talk about it all day long. So the other methodological issues kind of depend on what's going on in your field. Monitoring of implementation of the interventions. Fidelity, you can talk about the credentials and the training of the data collectors, the credentials and the training of the people delivering the intervention. And that, you know, some of this stuff overlaps quite a bit with what the intervention is, but all those kind of things. Some statistical things. Do they, when they report their outcome statistics, give you covariate adjusted means? That's another way of sort of thinking about, the authors thinking about the methodological quality and making use of that. And missing data. And we don't have a really good answer to the missing data question. I don't think anybody does. A lot of these primary studies that you'll code, as most of you know, are not going to have the same information, and not all of them are going to have all the answers to all of your questions. And how do you handle that? And that's, I don't know. Okay, here's a sample coding item that we use for assignment of participants to groups. And the first part of this question is, what was the unit of assignment? And we go through and code and think about this. And then the second part, you won't be able to read this, but you can see how detailed our coding manuals get. This is this long, detailed description of all the different kinds of random or near random designs that we might see in the social literature and how to identify them. And we put lots of synonyms in here for our coding team so they can start learning the different ways that people talk about these designs. Because you'll discover that when I say stratification or matching, somebody else might say stratification or matching. It means something a little bit different. So the more text we put in, we find it's helpful. And this thing goes on for half a page where it describes all the non-random designs as well. And most of this comes out of our experience with, you have studies that are being coded and somebody says, well, what do I do with this? and we make a decision and then add it to the code book. So that if we get another one that looks like this, everybody will know, oh, that's a regression discontinuity design. Okay, so what do you do when you're doing your own work? I think transparency is critical. Being systematic about it is important. Yes?
I had a question on the previous slide. When someone's starting a review, and for example, this is something we know that we're going to want to code for. Are there examples of this online that we can use as a starting point? Or do you suggest we start from scratch?
No, you should steal other people's work, totally. And if I can, I have several code books that we've used in our projects, and I'm happy to share them with anybody who emails me. I don't know, what we need to do is have some on the Campbell website and have different coding protocols. Because some reviews are much simpler than this and do different things, and we should do that. I think Eamon's writing that down and nodding his head. So, but really, you guys can email me, and I'll send you stuff. Okay. So I think, transparency is important, and coming up with a system that you like and that makes sense to you and that works with your literature and that you can justify to your funder is important. And I like to, because I'm like this sort of thing, take all those methodological variables and use them as moderators in my analyses. So I want to know what the effect size is for randomized studies versus the effect size for quasi-experiments. Because I want to know if they are different for my own edification, but why they might be different. I want to know if studies with more attrition come out with bigger effects than studies with less attrition, because you can imagine that that might be the case. So that's a lot of the reason why I think coding some of these methodological variables in a form that then you can plug into a regression model, if you have a big review, is interesting and helpful. Okay, how are we doing? Good. Somebody looked at their watch. You guys should, tell me to hurry up if I'm taking too much time. Okay. So moving on to really the fun part of why we do this stuff, which is thinking about the effects of interventions. Intervention coding, I think, is really interesting, because the more I learn about interventions, the more I realize how difficult it is to put your finger on what they are. And a lot of people will talk about what's cognitive behavioral therapy, or, I don't know, functional family therapy. Some systematic reviews are going to be on a particular type of thing, particular kind of mathematics curriculum, or a particular type of mental health program or health program. But a lot of times that's not so simple. And when doing bigger systematic reviews on bigger questions like conditional cash transfers in developing countries to encourage parents to send their kids to school, there are lots of different flavors of what a conditional cash transfer program might be. Or dropout programs or violence prevention programs. You can imagine there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat here. So all of these sorts of things help you and your readers get a sense of what the interventions really look like in practice. And I'll show you some of the different ways that I've thought about program types. But a lot of times I end up saying, well, this is a cognitive behavioral program, but then it's got all these other little pieces to it. And so I have some subcategories and different codes to be able to distinguish the programs from each other. Yeah?
So when your coders are coding like fidelity,
Mm-hmm.
is that a difference?
That is the hardest thing to code, and we have not come up with a good way to do it. But yes, it is. And because what happens as you guys know, everybody reports their implementation fidelity a little bit differently in the primary studies. It might be that some of the treatment delivery personnel got a bad attitude halfway through and dropped out, and you had to get new personnel. Or it might be that only half of the sessions got delivered because there was a flood and school let out early. Or, there's 100 different ways to think about whether what was in the treatment manual or what was intended to be delivered actually happened. And over the years, we've done text boxes where we just write in a box in our coding form what was reported and then figure out how to grade it later. Right now, we do a low, medium, high, and then have a big text box that describes the elements that were reported. One of the more objective, more reliable ways to code implementation fidelity is to think about dosage and how long the intervention is and how many sessions there are. And now I see two questions you can go first. And
just as a quick question, how much do you worry about coding implementation fidelity if someone used an intent to treat model or really dealt with the issue of, within a statistical analysis? So if the authors themselves chose to do an analysis of their own implementation fidelity, do you look at that? Do you ignore that? Do you own? How does that factor in?
In every meta-analysis I've ever worked on, where we do moderator analysis, so look at what the sources of the variability are in the effect sizes. Every single one, our crude low, medium, high implementation is the biggest predictor of effect size. So I think it's important, regardless of whether the authors of the primary study are doing a treatment on the treated or intent to treat, or if they come up with, and it's not very common, if they do follow-up analyses after their intent to treat kind of thing where they look at variations in fidelity and how that predicts the outcome, we try to use that to get a sense of how well implemented the intervention was. So I think this is one of the most important things to code about the interventions, because it does turn out to, if you're not doing the program and you get a small effect, that's one thing. If you're doing the program and you get a small effect, that's another. So, and Valerie.
Replications, like if it's a replication type, do you deal with? Because they're not always exactly replications, are they?
No. I have, in some of the things we've done, we've come up with items for coding the involvement of the program developer. Like, is this a study that the developer is doing, or is this someone who has taken the program and is testing it? And so we try to code that when we have it. For the most part, if someone says, I'm doing functional family therapy, we try to figure out how much of it they're doing or how close they stick to the manual, because a lot of times they'll say, well, we bought the functional family therapy model, but some of our therapists really were into X, and so they added a little session on with something else. So anything about that we can code, and we try to make it as quantitative as possible when we code these sort of things so that we can then use these variables as moderators. But sometimes you can't, and that's where a lot of these tables where you might describe each study and the characteristics of the intervention could be informative to your readers. And you can see that a lot in Campbell systematic reviews, where there'll be just a table of the primary studies, and it talks about the interventions Does that answer everybody's questions? Sort of. I think coding implementation is really difficult, and if anybody comes up with a good way to do it, I'd love to use it. This is another one of our coding screens for, this is a dropout, high school dropout programs project. So this had hundreds of studies, and we didn't care what the intervention was. All we were interested in is, did they measure dropout as an outcome? So it's a different kind of systematic review. But we went through and have all these little tick boxes with all the different program elements. And the idea at the end is maybe to come up with profiles of interventions that have multiple components and see if those are different. We can also do things like any study with class reorganization. Do those look different from studies with other components? This takes a long time though, and this, when we get to the common mistakes, stuff like this is time consuming and not a whole lot of fun, so it depends on how fired up you are about your topic. Okay, so the participants, the subjects, your clients or patients or villages or whoever you're trying to treat here with whatever intervention. It's a little different when you're doing this because your subjects or your clients are a group. So you're not coding individual people's characteristics. You're coding the group's characteristics. So we code things like the average age or the age range of the group. Both is helpful. Sometimes studies that have a really broad age range of participants are going to look a little different than those that focus on a particular age range. The gender mix, or if it's all one gender or all another. Racial ethnic mix of people. I find that in the social sciences, this is the most underreported thing in research. So anybody who does primary studies, tell us what your people look like. This is important stuff, and it's surprising that people don't report that. For social interventions, the risk level of the people in the interventions, how severe are their problems, what are their problems, and then, you know, are the interventions restrictive? Do they have special groups? Are they more inclusive? Okay, study outcomes. Now when you get to the effect sizes, this kind of goes with the effect sizes, sort of. And there's lots of different ways to do it and lots of different interesting things about the outcomes that you should code. Most importantly, what it is, the construct. And that's easier said than done. A lot of people who say they're measuring aggressive behavior are measuring something else. The child behavior checklist does not measure aggressive behavior. It measures a bunch of other things and maybe a little bit of aggressive behavior. So you sometimes have to really think about that it's not exactly what the authors say it is, but dig deeper and find out really what those constructs are. The informant, the form of the measure, is it a composite? Is it a single indicator? How is it measured quantitatively? Is it a yes-no thing? Is it a continuous scale? All that kind of thing. It does influence the size of the effect size that comes out of the measure, and it's important to know. Okay, so that was sort of the big coding picture, and really that's just to get you started about the kinds of things to think about when you're designing your own thing, because each coding book is different depending on your subject matter. But it really gets you in the frame of thinking about what's out there to code. When you get to this coding part, structuring how you do it is important to think about. Most meta-analytic data sets are hierarchical. It's not one intervention with one outcome with one post-test. It's one intervention with multiple outcomes with multiple measurement points, or they maybe do breakouts of the boys and the girls separately that you might be able to treat as two separate samples. And then there are going to be multiple effect sizes. So how you code this, you need to think about these things, because that's going to help you when you get to the analytic phase later on. I do it in hierarchical databases, but if it's a small systematic review, you can do it in a spreadsheet. It's pretty straightforward. So all of the study coding that I've been talking about up to now, like the publication year and the age of your sample and the treatment and the implementation fidelity and how many sessions there are, that's kind of a one per study sort of thing. So it's going to be one row. When you get down to the outcomes, you might have multiple outcomes from studies that you're interested in, like achievement, test scores, and GPA, and whether you finished school. Or whether your kids are going to school, whether they're eating the food that's given at the school, and what their health outcomes are. I mean, there are multiple outcomes. So then you would create multiple rows at this level describing the outcomes. And then at the effect size level, you'll have multiple effect sizes from that study. And keeping those things in that hierarchy is helpful. And it makes, once you do it, it'll make a lot more sense, because some people are looking a little unsure about this. I think I may have some pictures of a database that is hierarchical. But the idea is you don't want to have to double code the publication year for every effect size. You don't need to enter that number 6 times. You only need to enter it once. And then you can link up these files later on. Operationally, double coding is important, especially when you're talking about things like implementation, where it's hard to get reliable and different people are going to see different things. So having 2 people code is important. And having people reach agreement on the key decisions is important, like whether you're going to exclude or include a study, or what the risk of bias items are, or the effect sizes. You want to make sure those are right. And once you get your coding manual set up and designed, pilot test it. Grab a stack of 3 studies and use it and see if it works. See if you can actually go through and answer the questions that you want. Okay, and you guys have all, I've been talking about this all along. It's just sort of write up this thing, turn it into something that people can use. Yes, Valerie.
The double coding,
Mm-hmm.
is this independently done, and is there an expected level of intermediate reliability and agreement?
If you're going to double code every study, what I think you should do is independently double code every study, and then the ones where people are different on, get together and talk about it until you come to the same answer. So then at that point, there is no reliability. It's 100%. If you have a lot of studies that you're doing and you might only be working with a sample that you're double coding, then I would evaluate how reliable you are and decide kind of based on the basic psychometric rules. I mean, I would say you'd want to be at least 80%, if not more. I mean, because if you're unreliable 20% of the time, and a lot of times you'll identify when you're doing these kind of pilot tests and reliability checks, you'll identify the items that are problematic. Not because your coders are problematic, but because you didn't write an item that people can answer reliably. Okay, these are pictures of some of our databases and how we set these things up. So we have tons of items which is a huge mistake because it takes forever and it costs too much money, and you know. But we create these little menu-driven databases. It makes it really handy later on because I can just pluck out all those numbers and put them in Stata and do my analyses. But the coders have something that they can work with that makes sense to them. It's easy to use. We have help screens that you can click on so you can get more detail. This is our effect size coding. So we've programmed the most common effect size combinations. This one is more of a means and standard deviation, so like a Cohen's d effect size. We have different versions if the outcomes are mostly binary. As you get into more unconventional research designs, this gets more complicated. But this really helps us get reliable on our math because we let the computer do the math for us. And I'm happy to share any of these things with people too. Okay, so common mistakes. Too many coding items. You really have to think about, as you're reading your literature and designing your systematic review protocols, what you think the most critical aspects of the effective intervention are likely to be. You know, what do other people think is the most important thing about this intervention? Is it common thinking that the intervention is more effective for one kind of person than another? Those are the kind of things you want to code instead of coding everything but the kitchen sink. And then method quality is, of course, you always have to code that. Yes?
As you're talking, as I was looking at that previous screen and this screen where you're talking about coding too many items,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering about to what extent do you consider, or maybe perhaps you have, if you know that you can get access to the original data set, does that ever play a role in original data set, anything that you're coding? Like besides you or particular studies?
Right. We have thought about that. I do meta-analyses of longitudinal data, so studies that don't have interventions at all in one part of my work. And I have thought about getting the actual data sets and just coding exactly what I want from the real data. It depends on the size of your systematic review. That can be a huge project. If there are 50 studies and you can get all 50 data sets, I mean, you can spend the rest of your life working on that. Right. I have done that one time where there was a publicly available data set, and I pulled the data set and computed the effect sizes that met my eligibility criteria and pulled out the duration of the intervention and all those things and coded it. I think that's a fine idea. It's harder to do in practice. I know in medicine it's more common to have that kind of, that you can get access to other people's data in that way. And it's worth exploring, really, because you can get a lot more information that ends up in the published studies when you get the real data. I think this might be my last slide, so and then we can talk more. Yeah, okay. There's one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about, which is this. If you have a team of people who are working on a systematic review together, and somebody doesn't ask any questions, then they're probably doing it wrong. There's no way any of us can do this right on the first go, on the 50th go. I mean, I am always in my colleagues' offices with an article saying, well, what would you do with this? Or what are we going to do with this? Or what do you think about this? So if you're not talking to each other and people aren't asking questions, start asking questions, because I think that's really important. This is not easy to do, and it's not easy to do reliably. So, okay, so now we can have questions. I think you had the first question.
Yeah, this is, I guess, maybe more of a comment than a question, but it seems like when you're
Right.
Based on the hypothesis that you're actually trying to answer.
Right. Well, I mean, all of this is exploratory work. You're not answering causal questions by doing these moderator analyses. But you're right. And the way we do it, because we have all these coding items, is the first thing we do when we're doing an analysis is get our distribution of effect sizes and produce the correlation matrix of all the variables that we coded with each other and with the effect sizes. And then we make choices about the moderators that we use based on the correlation matrix. There are probably other ways to do it, like having a theory about what you think the important variables are, and those are the ones you're going to look at. Yeah, but you don't want to go fishing around. So you got to have some systematic way of doing it and justify it and report it and be open about it. And I think the way I do it with the correlation matrix, I'm sure there are people who think that's a bad idea. I can't think of a better way, short of going the whole other way, which is just at the very outset knowing I'm only going to look at these 5 and not looking at any other ones. So I don't have a good answer to that. It's more kind of your training and background, personal preferences, and what you think makes sense. If anybody else has another way of doing it, they can share it with us, maybe. And black and white shirt. I've forgotten your name.
What is
Okay. That's when you start out coding one way, and 50 studies later, you've sort of drifted, and that. Trying to think of a good example. It happens mostly with subjective coding items, where you start maybe going more one direction. And it's something to go back and look at your studies that you've coded in the past. I mean, we do these big meta-analyses where there are hundreds of studies. And so the way I think about treatment dosage may have somehow subtly changed in my head without me knowing about it from the beginning to the end. So I often will go back and kind of check how I was thinking about something a month ago and make sure I'm still doing it the same way. And across coders, we do the same thing to make sure we sort of still think about how we answer a question and answer it the same way every time. Yes, sir?
With regard to bullet 3, do you feel differently if the 2 reports were related, but one was the effect of some program on attitudes and the other was the effect of some program on achievement?
This gentleman was asking about point 3, about coding 2 reports as the same study, as 2 different studies. And he said, what if it's 2 reports and one had the attitude outcomes and one had achievement or something? If it's the same study participants, if it's the same people, and the same randomization of those people, in my opinion, those 2 reports are the same study. And that if my systematic review was interested in both kinds of outcomes, I would code them both, and they would be the same study. It would be one study with 2 reports. Does that make sense?
If one of your research questions, though, was
About the attitudes.
Differences across outcomes, you needed a way to distinguish.
Well, but you couldn't, because you can't count that sample of individuals twice. And right next door, they're talking about some techniques for how to analyze meta-analytic data where it's the same sample, but you have multiple effect sizes, and you want to compare them within an analysis. So there are some new techniques for doing that. But you never want to treat it as 2 independent studies or 2 independent samples, because it's not. And you behind the blue shirt, I'm sorry, I keep pointing at you.
I have sort of a similar question about how you differentiate.
About, when we say study, And a lot of people, when we say study, a lot of people might hear journal article. Or hear the name of a study, like the NICHD study of early child care. But really, a study is the sample of people in that study. And so if the sample changes, it's not the same study anymore. And it gets complicated when you have, say, one publication that comes out with this group of 100 kids, and then the next publication comes out and there may be 25 kids who are the same, and then the 75 who are different. And I think you have to pick one in that case, because you can't treat them as independent and you can't treat them as the same.
Say the same thing about like Wilson follow-up, where you start off with 200 patients and then 2 years later you evaluate 100 of them, the other 100 died of cancer. So you're sort of looking at
Yeah, and I don't know. That's a really good question, because that's kind of this attrition question, like how much is too much? When does it become not the same study because you've lost so many people? And we typically will have eligibility requirements that have to do with attrition. There's sort of a, if you go over 25% attrition, then it's not eligible because it doesn't meet the design requirements of having a real design, or the design is not the same at the end of the study. But I really don't know how to analyze that. You should ask the other Wilson, because he is the effect size expert. So now I can't remember who raised their hand first. So we'll go to you and then you.
Interesting question. I have a problem with a study that was done by a group of researchers, and they found they had certain findings that others disagreed with. So another group of researchers came in and analyzed the same data from the same school district, and magically came up with something different. Each of them had bias. Each of the studies had
Right.
bias. Now, do I throw both of them out? I can't throw one out and keep one, because that's problematic.
Well, it depends. Were they both, because the numbers that you might pull out of either of those studies to create your effect size, so the means and standard deviations, for example, did those change?
What changed was the second group of researchers that had to do with alternatively certified teachers.
Uh-huh.
Compared to traditionally certified. The second group of researchers, the first group, compared alternatively certified to all teachers. The second group came in and said, no, you have to take out those who were under emergency licenses or long-term subs. Because
So they changed the comparison group.
They changed the comparison group, yeah. And both of these are very high-profile.
All right, of course.
With big deals.
I don't know. I think there's an argument to be made for taking the first study done by the first team because it's their study and that's how they reported it. And there's an argument to be made for maybe, and especially if you're going on this sort of intent to treat model, which would be the ideal thing. You want to have the people in your effect size that were assigned to the extent that you can. And so if they start changing the groups around, you no longer have this, what was the original design of the study. When it's a quasi-experiment to begin with, though, how they created that comparison group may not be legit on the first go. So I don't know. I think it's a matter of picking the one that you think meets your criteria and is of the best quality and justifying it, and be prepared for the other authors to hey, Dr. Early, how come you used that other guy's study? Yeah. All right. Yes.
I have an article question. The item in the Wall Street Journal last Friday
Uh-huh.
about the number of publications and journals are now being retracted at an unprecedented rate because of errors and methodological flaws.
Yes.
My question to the Campbell or the Cochrane review, what is your obligation then to go back and search for those publications that are in the reviews?
Oh, and take them out?
Or, and well, how does that happen?
Good question. I don't know. I don't think we have a policy. And see, now our CEO has disappeared right when you asked the hard question. That's a good question, and I'm inclined to think that if it turns out that a study that I include in my review had bad data, like they reported the wrong numbers or they cheated or lied about the numbers, that I'd want to go back and redo it. If they want to retract it for some other reason, because they want to massage the data a little bit and come up with a different answer.
These are definitely based on law.
Yeah.
The data was either done in error or fraudulent.
Yeah. Because that's, I mean, when you think about it with educational research, until we had mixed models and HLM to analyze cluster randomized trials, we were all analyzing our data incorrectly. And so maybe the means from those studies would be the same regardless of how you did it, and in fact they are, but the standard deviations change. And so now we have ways of adjusting for those kind of things, but many, many systematic reviews that have been published in the past are using standard errors that are too big or too small, depending on. So I don't know.
That would be included in subsequent updates.
And it should be, yes.
Right. But I was wondering if, you published a review and you find out in 2 years, well before an update is really necessary.
Right, would you go back and do? I don't know. All of the Campbell editors are meeting tonight to talk about stuff, so it would be good to bring this up. So how's my timing? I see people hovering out in the hall. Oh, all right. Thank you. You guys can ask more questions if you want. But.